Morgan Housel spent years writing about finance and the market before arriving at a conclusion that bothers a good part of the financial industry. Success with money has less to do with technical intelligence and much more to do with behavior. You can be brilliant at financial mathematics, understand markets deeply, and still make terrible decisions with your own money. And you can have very little technical training and still build a solid financial life, simply by maintaining consistent habits over decades. Before we continue, if you're not yet part of the channel, now is the right time to subscribe, so you don't miss upcoming content about behavior, money, and mindset. And leave a comment below with which city you're watching from. I love seeing where each person who arrives here comes from. This is the book's central thesis. Money is not, in practice, a purely technical discipline. It is a behavioral, emotional, almost psychological discipline. That's why, instead of complex formulas, the author chooses to tell a series of small stories, around 18 or 19 of them, each one isolating a bias, a habit, or an attitude that silently shapes a person's financial outcomes over the course of a lifetime. What makes this approach interesting is that it doesn't require any prior knowledge of economics. The ideas make sense to anyone because they don't talk about charts or indices. They talk about fear, pride, comparison, patience, and identity. In this commented summary, we'll go through each of the book's most important concepts with an explanation in simple words, followed by a comment on what this really means in practice and a suggestion for applying it to your daily life. The purpose here is not to replace reading the original book, but to offer an entry point, a way to already start thinking differently about money today, even before reading the full work. It's also worth highlighting why this type of approach works so well. Almost all traditional financial education is built on top of numbers, formulas, and spreadsheets, as if money were essentially an engineering problem. But engineers don't panic and sell a bridge at half price just because they got scared by some news. People do this with investments all the time. And it's exactly this human, emotional, and unpredictable component that most conventional financial education leaves out, and that this book courageously places at the center of the conversation. 1. No one is crazy, they're just reacting to their own history. One of the book's starting points is simple but profoundly liberating. Other people's financial decisions seem irrational when viewed from the outside, but they make perfect sense when viewed from within each person's own life experience. Each person carries a unique relationship with money, shaped by the generation they were born into, by the financial education, or lack of it, they received at home, by the economic ups and downs they lived through firsthand, and even by the luck or bad luck they had at decisive moments. This explains why two people, with the same income level and the same access to information, can make completely opposite financial decisions. Someone who lived through a severe financial crisis up close, the loss of a job, a family bankruptcy, a debt that seemed impossible to pay off, will likely develop a much more cautious relationship with risk than someone who grew up in an environment of constant stability. Neither of the two is right or wrong in any absolute sense. They're simply responding consistently to very different experiences. It's worth dwelling on this. This concept changes the way we should judge both others and ourselves. It's easy to look at someone's financial behavior, spending too much, saving too much, avoiding any risk, taking on excessive risk, and label it irrational or wrong. But most of the time, there's a very clear emotional logic behind that choice, even if it never shows up in a spreadsheet or a cold analysis of numbers. This also has an important implication for relationships and families. Discussions about money between couples, between parents and children, or between business partners are frequently not discussions about numbers. They're clashes between different emotional histories that were never explicitly shared. A small exercise can help here. Before judging a financial habit of yours, or of someone close to you, as simply irrational, it's worth asking, where did this reaction really come from? What experience, lived or observed, might have planted this way of reacting? Often, understanding the origin of a behavior is the first real step toward actually changing it, because behaviors that are never understood are rarely overcome, only temporarily suppressed, until they come back under pressure. 2. Luck and risk are two sides of the same coin. Housel argues that a large part of what we call financial success and financial failure carries a significant component of luck and bad luck that is rarely acknowledged publicly. Success stories that circulate socially tend to attribute everything to skill and personal merit. Failure stories, on the other hand, tend to be attributed entirely to errors in judgment. Reality almost always lies somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. The author uses the example of investors who made practically identical decisions but got completely different results simply because of the timing of their actions or because of external factors completely outside the control of any technical analysis. This doesn't mean that competence and effort don't matter. It means they don't tell the whole story. There's something important here. This is, perhaps, one of the hardest concepts to accept emotionally, because it directly challenges the narrative we like to tell about ourselves, that we fully control our results through effort and intelligence. Recognizing the role of luck doesn't diminish the value of work done well, but it avoids two common and opposite mistakes: the overconfidence of someone who attributes all past success solely to their own genius, and the excessive guilt of someone who attributes all past failure solely to their own incompetence. It's also worth highlighting a related psychological phenomenon. After an outcome happens, the mind tends to rewrite the story as if that outcome were obvious and inevitable from start. This is called hindsight bias, and it profoundly distorts the way we evaluate our own past decisions, making us unfairly harsh on choices that, at the moment they were made, were perfectly reasonable given the information available. A simple way to apply this is, the next time a financial decision of yours, an investment, a career choice, a negotiation, turns out well, try to mentally separate two things. How much was really the result of your reasoning, and how much was timing, luck, or external circumstance? And do the same exercise when a decision turns out badly. Judging decisions by the quality of the reasoning at the moment they were made, rather than just by the final outcome, is a much healthier and much more accurate way to learn from your own financial journey. 3. Never enough, greed's blind spot. One of the book's most cited chapters shows how greed, when it doesn't have a clearly defined limit, can lead even extremely successful people to put everything at risk in pursuit of more. The problem, according to the author, is not ambition itself. It's the absence of a personal, concrete definition of what it means to have enough. Without that reference point, every new financial milestone reached stops bringing lasting satisfaction because the goal simply shifts a bit further ahead. It's a known psychological pattern. What once seemed like a distant, exciting goal quickly becomes the new normal, generating practically no sense of accomplishment. This changes the way we see the situation. This is, without a doubt, one of the concepts that resonates most with people's real experience, regardless of income level. It's common to hear accounts of professionals who reached exactly the salary they dreamed of years ago, and who, months after achieving it, are already dissatisfied again, aiming for the next level. This doesn't happen because the money is insufficient. It happens because there was never, to begin with, a clear definition of what would be enough. The culture of constant comparison, amplified by social media, where we only see the edited financial highlights of other people's lives, significantly worsens this effect. We are constantly comparing our full reality, with all its details and difficulties, to an edited, incomplete version of other people's lives. It's worth trying the following. Set aside a quiet moment to write down, concretely and specifically, not in vague terms like being rich or having security, what enough means exactly for you. What emergency reserve amount would bring real peace of mind? What income level would allow you to live without constant anxiety about bills? Having that definition in writing creates a stable reference point that external social comparison has much more difficulty displacing. For the almost boring power of compound interest. One of the book's best-known examples is the fact that the overwhelming majority of Warren Buffett's fortune was built after he turned 60. Not because he suddenly became a more skilled investor at that stage of life, but because he had entire decades of time to let compound growth operate silently in the background. The central point here isn't about investment technique. It's about time. Compounding doesn't reward intensity, it rewards duration. And duration is something profoundly counterintuitive to the human mind, which is naturally more sensitive to immediate, visible rewards than to slow, silent processes. Think about the following. Compound growth doesn't look impressive in the early years. It looks almost stagnant, almost irrelevant, until at some point it stops looking that way quite suddenly to an outside observer. Most people abandon this type of process exactly during its most boring phase, exactly before the effect starts to become significantly visible. This also explains why repeatedly interrupting and restarting a financial plan, withdrawing investments, pausing contributions, rebuilding the strategy from scratch with every crisis of confidence is so much more harmful than it seems at first glance. Each interruption doesn't just delay the process. It effectively resets a good part of the effect accumulated up to that point. Here's the central point. Instead of obsessively tracking the absolute value of your account or investment every month, which almost always seems discouraging in the early years, try tracking your consistency. How many months in a row have you kept up the habit of saving or investing, regardless of what happened to the total value? This is a metric that's entirely under your control, even when the financial result isn't visible yet. 5. Getting rich is different from staying rich. Getting rich almost always requires taking on some level of risk, optimism, and willingness to put yourself in uncertain positions. Staying rich, on the other hand, requires practically the opposite skill: humility, caution, and a certain healthy respect for the fear of losing everything that was built. These are two genuinely distinct skills, and many people master only the first one without ever developing the second. It's worth stopping on this. This is one of the book's most underrated points, and also one of the most applicable outside a purely financial context. Long-term survival, whether financial, professional, or even personal, depends much more on avoiding catastrophic, irreversible decisions than on accumulating brilliant ones. You don't need to be the boldest or most aggressive person in the group. You need to be the person who stays in the game the longest, because time, as we saw in the previous point, is the true engine of compound growth. There's a subtle but important difference between optimism and recklessness. Genuine optimism recognizes that, in the long run, good things tend to outweigh bad ones. Recklessness completely ignores the possibility of a catastrophic, irreversible event along the way. Good financial planning manages to hold both things at once: optimism about the distant future and healthy paranoia about any risk that could take you out of the game permanently. A good practice is, before any major financial decision, an aggressive investment, a significant loan, a risky career change, ask yourself not just, how much can I gain from this? But also, is there any scenario, even an unlikely one, in which this decision takes me out of the game permanently and irreversibly? If the answer is yes, it's worth reconsidering the proportion of risk taken, even if the potential return looks attractive. 6. Rare events explain almost everything. A small number of disproportionately large events tends to be responsible for most long-term financial results, whether they are individual investments within a portfolio, decisions within a career, or bets within a business. You don't need to be right most of the time. You just need to be right occasionally and sufficiently significantly that those few wins make up for all the smaller mistakes along the way. This is the part that really matters. This idea completely changes how we should evaluate individual decisions within a broader strategy. An investor, an entrepreneur, or even someone building a career rarely grows in a linear, predictable way. Growth normally happens through a few disproportionately important events, surrounded by a much larger number of attempts that didn't amount to anything special. This has a relevant emotional implication. It's normal, and even expected, that most individual attempts won't work out as planned. The mistake isn't having attempts that don't work out. It's giving up on the whole process before the disproportionately good attempt has a chance to happen. Notice what this reveals. The most important thing isn't getting every financial or professional decision right. It's remaining positioned consistently and patiently long enough to be present when the rare, disproportionately positive event finally happens, because it tends to happen for those who stay in the game and tend to go unnoticed by those who give up too soon. 7. The man in the car paradox. This is probably one of the book's most cited concepts. When you see someone driving an extremely expensive car, the automatic thought is almost never, "What an impressive person." It's, most of the time, something closer to, "I wish I had that car." In other words, the people around admire the object, not necessarily the person behind it. The paradox is exactly here. Those who buy visible, expensive goods hoping to generate admiration or respect from others generally do get attention, but that attention normally goes to the item itself, not to the person behind it. The car becomes the protagonist of the scene. The owner, curiously, almost disappears from it. This explains something that goes unnoticed. This concept is a silent but powerful invitation to reevaluate why we spend what we spend. If the real goal behind a big, visible purchase is to be respected, admired, or noticed, it's worth stopping to consider that this goal is rarely achieved in the way expected, because people's attention, in practice, tend to fix on the object, not on who's behind it. This doesn't mean buying nice things is wrong. It just means honestly separating two very different motivations. Buying something because it genuinely brings you personal pleasure and usefulness, and buying something hoping it will change how others see you. A simple step helps put this into practice. Before a big, particularly visible purchase, a car, a house bigger than necessary, a status item, ask yourself honestly, am I buying this for myself, for the real usefulness and pleasure it brings me? Or am I buying this for the reaction I expect to provoke in other people? There's no right or wrong answer, but clarity about the real motivation avoids spending that, deep down, never delivers the emotional satisfaction it promised. 8. Wealth is what you don't see. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive concept in the whole book. Real wealth, financial reserves, accumulated investments, future financial freedom is, by definition, invisible to others. What is visible is spending and possessions, which actually represent money that has already left your pocket, and which therefore reduce the real wealth accumulated, rather than demonstrating it. There is then a very common confusion between looking rich and being rich. Looking rich involves spending visibly. Being rich involves, most of the time, not spending what you could spend precisely to keep financial options open in the future. In practice, these are almost opposite behaviors. This is one of the most revealing points here. This concept explains a curious social phenomenon. Why so many people with an outward appearance of financial success actually live under constant financial pressure, while others, with a much more discreet appearance, have real, solid financial security behind the scenes. Society, in general, socially rewards those who look rich, but those who actually build lasting wealth are usually doing exactly the opposite of what attracts that kind of attention. Worth trying in practice. The next time you feel the urge to demonstrate financial progress through a visible, immediate purchase, remember that real wealth is almost always being built silently, far from any kind of social spotlight. Consider creating, for yourself, private ways to track that progress, such as periodically reviewing your reserve or your investments, since it will never be visible to those looking from outside. 9. Nothing is free, not even market returns. The author compares stock market volatility to a kind of mandatory entrance fee. It's not possible to get long-term market returns without paying, along the way, the psychological price of uncertainty, sudden drops, and periods of instability. Anyone who panics and sells their assets during a downturn is, in practice, refusing to pay this entrance fee, and by doing so, ends up giving up exactly the long-term gain that would normally come after that turbulent period. Worth reflecting on this calmly. This reframing, seemingly simple, completely changes how we view financial instability. Instead of seeing volatility as a fine, something that happened because you did something wrong, you come to see it as a fee, the normal, expected cost of participating in any long-term growth process. This shift in perspective significantly reduces the temptation to make rash decisions precisely in moments of greatest emotional instability. A small habit helps to fix this idea. before reacting impulsively to a market drop, a particularly bad financial month, or any temporary instability. Ask yourself, is this really a fine for some mistake I made, or is it just the entrance fee that I already rationally knew was part of the process from the start? 10. Margin of safety, the ingredient almost no one plans for. The book consistently argues that extremely rigid financial plans, with no room reserved for the unexpected, tend to break sooner or later, not necessarily because they were poorly thought out on paper, but precisely because they leave no margin at all for unexpected events, which are practically guaranteed over any sufficiently long period of time. Here lies something subtle but decisive. Having a financial safety reserve isn't about pessimism or expecting everything to go wrong. It's about ensuring that you can keep making calm, rational decisions even when life, inevitably, doesn't follow exactly the script you had planned. A plan with no margin of error at all isn't a disciplined plan. It's a fragile one that depends on absolutely nothing turning out differently than expected. There's also an important emotional dimension here, beyond the purely financial one. Simply knowing that you have a safety margin already significantly reduces everyday anxiety about money, even before you actually need to use it. Here's a practical way to apply this. Honestly review some recurring expense in your life that exists much more out of habit than real need. It's not necessary to eliminate it completely. Just consider redirecting part of it to start building the safety margin that may not yet exist. 11. You will change, and your financial plan should too. A simple idea, but rarely taken seriously. The person you are today, with today's goals, values, and priorities, will probably not be exactly the same person 10, 20, or 30 years from now. Extremely rigid financial plans, designed to last decades without any kind of adjustment along the way, frequently ignore this rather obvious fact of human nature. This realization changes everything. This isn't a reason not to plan for the future. It's a reason to plan with a healthy degree of flexibility, accepting from the start that periodic reassessments are a natural part of the process and in no way represent a failure of the original plan drawn up years earlier. A simple way to test this is set aside a moment, once a year, to honestly review whether your current financial goals still reflect who you are today, not who you were when you first set them. Adjusting the plan isn't abandoning discipline. It's a different, equally valid way of exercising it. 12. Reasonable is more sustainable than purely rational. The author argues that financial decisions that are perfectly rational from a mathematical standpoint aren't always the smartest decisions in practice, because they completely ignore the emotional and psychological component of whoever will actually live with that decision, day after day, year after year. A strategy that's merely reasonable, which you manage to maintain consistently over decades, tends to produce much better results than a theoretically optimal strategy that you abandon at the first crisis of confidence. Worth highlighting what's behind this. This concept is especially valuable because it validates something many people feel guilty about doing. Choosing a simpler, more conservative, or more emotionally comfortable financial approach, even knowing that, on paper, a technically superior alternative would exist. If that superior alternative generates so much anxiety that you'll probably abandon it at the first moment of stress, it was never, in practice, the best choice for you. Worth putting this into practice like this. When evaluating any financial strategy for investing, saving, managing debt, ask yourself not just, is this mathematically optimal, but also, could I really maintain this strategy consistently, even during a period of financial or emotional stress? The second question is often more important than the first. 13. Beware the seduction of pessimism. There's a curious and rarely discussed bias. Pessimistic predictions about the economy, the market, or the financial future tend to sound smarter and more serious than optimistic predictions, even when both have exactly the same quality of evidence behind them. This happens because pessimism tends to come with a sense of urgency. It sounds like an important warning demanding immediate attention, while optimism tends to sound like an invitation to complacency. This connects directly to everyday life. This asymmetry has a relevant practical effect. Pessimistic news and predictions circulate and influence financial decisions disproportionately relative to their real probability of coming true. This can lead to overly defensive decisions, made out of fear rather than a balanced assessment of the real probabilities involved. A concrete way to apply this idea. When you come across a particularly alarming financial prediction, whether about the economy in general or about a specific investment, it's worth asking, does this prediction seem convincing because the evidence is really strong, or because the pessimistic tone naturally sounds more serious and more trustworthy? Separating these two things avoids disproportionate, fear-based reactions. 14. Everyone is playing a different game. A common mistake is observing another person's financial behavior, a specific investment, a spending decision, a long-term strategy, and trying to copy it directly without considering that this person may, in practice, be playing a completely different game from yours, with entirely different goals, time frames, and risk tolerance. It's important to stress the following. A large part of the wrong financial decisions people make aren't wrong in themselves. They're simply correct decisions for someone else's game, incorrectly applied to your own game. A very short-term investor and an investor thinking in decades can look at exactly the same financial asset and make opposite decisions, both being perfectly rational within their own context. Try the following. Before replicating any financial strategy observed in someone else, an influencer, a successful friend, or a relative, ask yourself, is this person playing the same game as me, with the same time horizon, the same goals, and the same risk tolerance? If the answer is no, that strategy may be perfectly smart for them and still completely inappropriate for you. 15. The true purpose of money is freedom. After going through all these concepts, the book converges on one final, unifying idea. Money's greatest real benefit isn't found in the things it can buy, but in the freedom it provides over your own time, the ability to choose how, when, and with whom to spend your days without depending entirely on the approval, pace, or demands of anyone else. This detail makes all the difference. This conclusion ties all the previous concepts together around a single thread. Margin of safety exists to protect that freedom. Invisible wealth is, in practice, future freedom silently accumulated. Defining enough is recognizing the point at which there's already enough freedom that you don't need more. Avoiding catastrophic decisions is protecting that freedom from being irreversibly destroyed. Worth trying this reflection. The next time you face an important financial decision, try reframing the central question. Instead of asking only, will this make me richer? Also ask, will this give me more control over my own time or less? That question, on its own, tends to considerably simplify decisions that, at first glance, seem complex. 16. Saving doesn't depend on how much you earn. One of the book's most practical points is also one of the most underrated. A person's savings rate has much more to do with their level of humility, self-control, and willingness to live below their means than with the absolute size of their income. There are people with modest salaries who accumulate real wealth over a lifetime, and people with very high incomes who remain financially fragile, simply because their standard of living grows at the same speed or even faster than their income. This happens because, for most people, every increase in income is quickly absorbed by an equivalent increase in standard of living, a better car, a bigger house, more expensive dinners. This phenomenon is so common that it already has a name among behavioral economists: lifestyle inflation. And the problem isn't the spending itself. It's that it happens almost automatically, never being a conscious choice. This deserves special attention. This idea is particularly liberating for anyone who feels they don't earn enough to save. Saving isn't, in most cases, a matter of waiting to earn more in the future. It's a matter of deliberately protecting a portion of any income, large or small, from the automatic increase in consumption that normally accompanies each new salary level. There's also a less obvious benefit to saving more than strictly necessary: flexibility. A high savings rate doesn't just serve to accumulate wealth in the long run. It also creates room to make important life decisions, like changing careers, negotiating a better salary, or simply getting through a difficult period, without the weight of immediate financial pressure. A direct way to apply this. The next time you get a raise, even a small one, try setting aside a fixed part of it before any other spending decision directly into savings or investments, as if that amount had never existed in your monthly budget. Automating this decision removes much of the willpower effort it would normally require. 17. The past is not a reliable map of the future. The author warns that it's tempting and extremely common to use the history of a market, an economy, or a specific investment as if it were a reliable map for predicting what will happen in the future. But major financial events, both positive and negative, tend to arise precisely from situations that had never happened before in exactly that way. Relying too much on historical patterns creates a false sense of predictability about something that, at its core, remains genuinely uncertain. Worth dwelling on this. This doesn't mean studying financial history is useless. It just means it should be treated as an approximate guide to human behavior over time, not as an exact formula capable of predicting the next big event. The specific details of each crisis or growth period tend to differ from previous ones, even though the emotional patterns behind them, fear, greed, overconfidence, remain surprisingly similar throughout history. Here's a simple exercise. When making long-term financial decisions, use history to understand how people tend to react emotionally in the face of uncertainty. This repeats itself fairly consistently, but avoid relying on it to precisely predict the next specific events. Building a flexible plan, capable of adapting to scenarios you can't even imagine today, tends to be more effective than trying to predict exactly what the next big financial event will be. 18. The final confession. The author doesn't follow perfect rules either. One of the most honest parts of the book is when the author himself admits that his personal financial strategy is not, in any way, technically optimal by conventional financial standards. He keeps a significant part of his wealth in cash, which from a purely mathematical standpoint represents a real opportunity cost. And the reason behind this choice isn't ignorance of that cost. It's a conscious decision to prioritize emotional peace of mind and a sense of security above the maximum theoretically possible return. There's something important here. This final confession sums up, in a way, the whole spirit of the book. There is no single financial strategy that's universally correct, applicable in the same way to any person. There's the strategy that's mathematically optimal on paper, and there's the strategy that a specific person with their own history, their own fears, and their own emotional tolerance can actually sustain over decades. The second one, in practice, almost always wins over the first, because it's the only one that will actually be followed through to the end. This is also an invitation to self-compassion. Many people carry guilt for not following the perfect financial strategy recommended by some expert, even when that strategy never took into account their own personality and their own emotional history with money. Recognizing that even the author of a book on financial psychology deliberately makes suboptimal choices in the name of his own peace of mind is, in a way, a permission to do the same. Worth adopting this practice. When building or reviewing your own financial plan, consciously allow yourself to give up some theoretical optimization in exchange for real emotional peace of mind, whether by keeping a bigger reserve than strictly necessary or by avoiding a technically superior investment that would cause constant anxiety. This isn't a flaw in the plan. It's often what makes a financial plan truly sustainable over a lifetime. Conclusion. The book's invitation. In the end, the central message of The Psychology of Money isn't about investment formulas, nor about specific market strategies. It's about recognizing that behavior beats technical knowledge when it comes to money, and that true financial freedom is, above all, about controlling your own time without depending on the pace, approval, or constant comparison with anyone else. It's worth quickly revisiting the thread that runs through all 18 concepts in this summary. No one is irrational, they're just responding to their own history. Luck and risk shape outcomes more than we like to admit. Greed without a clear limit never brings lasting satisfaction. Time, not intensity, is what makes compound growth work. Staying in the game matters more than risking everything in pursuit of spectacular results. A few rare events explain most outcomes. Visible possessions rarely deliver the respect they promise. Real wealth is silent. Volatility is a fee, not a fine. Margin of safety protects against the unexpected. You will change, and your plan should change too. Reasonable, sustained over decades, beats rational, abandoned at the first crisis. Pessimism sounds smarter than it really is. Everyone plays a different game. And in the end, it all converges on a single goal: freedom over your own time. If you want to start applying these ideas in practice, you don't need to try to absorb all 18 concepts at once. Choose just one, the one that bothered you the most, or that made the most sense given your own history with money, and apply only that one consistently over the coming weeks. Real change in financial behavior rarely happens all at once. It happens slowly through small, repeated decisions over time in exactly the same silent, gradual way that the book itself describes how compound interest works. Perhaps the greatest gift this book offers isn't any specific technique, but rather a permission. Permission to stop measuring your financial life by someone else's ruler and to start building, deliberately and patiently, your own definition of security, sufficiency, and freedom.